Hello, History of Sexuality students. This is Professor Bowen here with some comments on our Week 3 discussions. Now, we had a lot of back and forth over the question of ancient Greek pederasty and how that compares to the modern term and practice that is pedophilia. A lot of questions about what exactly makes these two things different. Are they even that different? I got a lot of comments, a lot of questions about this. From our discussion, it seems like for the most part, we agree that pederasty is a social institution, whereas by contrast, pedophilia is just about sexual acts, which for the most part consist of various forms of non-consensual sex, including rape. Most of us concluded that pederasty was the right word to use when talking about boy love in ancient Greece, whereas today we only have pedophilia. But some of us, rightly, I think, questioned the notion that we can draw a firm dividing line between ancient pederasty and modern pedophilia. Some asked, for example, if there might have also been pedophiles in ancient Greece, or whether or not things like the rape of boys or young men happened here. Along the same lines, some suggested that the whole idea of ancient Greek men serving as quote-unquote mentors to male youths might have simply been a justification or a cover for sexual exploitation and abuse of people in a relatively powerless position. These are all excellent things to ponder over, and as we continue to do so, it would be helpful to do so with more contextual knowledge and some additional information about the differences between boy love then and now. Before getting into this, I should say that the subject of intergenerational sex has, on the whole, not received that much attention from historians. Historians have generally been reluctant to talk about, research, and write about same-sex sexual encounters involving boys. And there are reasons for this. One of them is that historians are people. And like most people, the topic of pedophilia is one that elicits a strong emotional reaction in them. Because of this, many don't think they can evaluate pedophilia in a careful, that is to say, historians generally don't think that they can evaluate pedophilia in a considerate, objective way. Today, most people see pedophilia as something truly monstrous. Studying it seems to violate a universal moral taboo. Secondly, it bears noting that the decade when historical scholarship on homosexuality really became a big thing was the 1980s. The 1980s was the same decade that witnessed a massive backlash against the gay rights movement. Conservative critics of the movement often attacked gays and lesbians by calling them pedophiles who endangered the world's children. Historians of the 1980s were worried, justifiably I'd say, about researching something that could feed the conservative attack on homosexuality, and as such, they stayed away from the topic of intergenerational sex. In this, they were not alone. Gay rights groups also responded to these criticisms by drawing a sharp line between their own advocacy for the legalization of sexual relations between consenting adults and any defense of intergenerational sex. The most visible sign of this happened in 1993, when the International Lesbian and Gay Association expelled a pedophile rights group, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, or NAMBLA, from its ranks. On account of these things, it is only very recently that historians have begun to talk about this topic, and so we don't know as much as we probably should. But we do know some things, and what we know suggests that ideas about childhood and sexuality have changed quite a lot over the centuries. Up until recently, the idea that children were sexual beings was widely accepted. Consider, for example, marriage practices among the European nobility. At the age of 14, for example, the son of the French King Louis XIII was married off, placed into bed with his wife, and expected to perform sexually. Another famous example is Lady Margaret Beaufort, the mother of King Henry VII. In 1450, at the age of 6 years old, Margaret was engaged. Though the marriage was later dissolved, at the age of 12, she was put into another arranged marriage. A year later, she was widowed, only to find herself 7 months pregnant. One might say that these practices were only common among royalty, but that doesn't appear to be the case. Sources from 17th century England, for example, tell us that girls were typically married before the age of 12, and sex with a girl over this age was considered acceptable. If the idea of young love was also accepted until quite recently, so was the phenomena of intergenerational sex. 19th and early 20th century Western societies exhibit a great deal of tolerance for intimate relationships between children and adults. Examples of this abound. Consider, for example, Lewis Carroll, author of the popular children's book Alice's Adventures in Wonderland from 1905. While writing this, Carroll regularly entertained girls between the ages of 5 and 11 in his private rooms at Oxford University, where he was the don of mathematics. While it's not clear if Carroll ever had sex with any of these girls, he certainly did take photographs of them naked. He faced no censure for these actions. Neither did J.M. Barrie, author of Peter Pan from 1902. In another book called The Little White Bird, Barrie described a physical relationship with a young boy whom he disrobed. Again, no one had problems with this. A reviewer in the Literary Times wrote, quote, "If a book exists which contains more knowledge and more love of children, we do not know it." It's really only since the 1970s that cross-generational sex has come to be seen as dangerous, evil, and morally atrocious. In the 1980s, stories about Catholic priests sexually abusing young boys and girls, about the existence of child sex rings in major European cities, and about pedophiles' rights groups fueled outrage at the phenomenon. And as moral panic against the practice grew, pedophilia was increasingly seen as vile and disgusting. Medical professionals and social scientists began studying it more and more and classifying it within text about psychiatric disorders. From these studies, we've come to learn a great deal about pedophilia, and all of the evidence suggests that it is a quite different thing than the ancient Greek institution of pederasty. Consider some facts. In ancient Greece, pederastic relationships typically involved men over the age of 25 and boys who were between 14 and 18. The relationship was expected to stop when the younger partner's facial hair first sprouted. Men who had relationships with boys under 12 were looked down upon because doing this was thought to stunt their sexual development and prevent the onset of puberty. By contrast, studies of modern-day pedophilia indicate that in most cases, this involves boys and girls who are between 8 and 11 years old, and in some cases as young as 3. A second key difference is that pederasty operated out in the open, with full community and familial approval. In ancient Greece, there were accepted social rules for how a pederastic relationship was supposed to begin. It began with the Erastes approaching the boy's family for permission to abduct him. If the family disagreed, they would chase the man away and capture him until he gave up on the relationship. The eromenos also had a say in things and could refuse prospective suitors. The erastes also got something out of the relationship. In Sparta, for example, the erastes would get a full suit of armor, a set of weapons, a drinking cup to be used at symposia, and other material goods that signified their transition into manhood and their new status as citizens. Pedophilia, by contrast, is something that takes place in secret and involves hiding the truth of that relationship from others. There's nothing communal about pedophilia at all. Instead of being structured by community rules, groups like NAMBLA want to remove community governance from these relationships. Indeed, one of NAMBLA's goals is to abolish all age of consent laws, their argument being that people should have the right to decide for themselves when to have sex, regardless of their age. So those are two of the big differences between ancient pederasty and modern-day pedophilia. I guess in addition to this, we could say that in ancient Greece, this institution of boy love was genuinely one of older men loving younger boys, whereas today, pederasty typically involves relationships between adult men and very young girls, which did not play into ancient pederasty in Greece at all, girls being secluded up until the time that they were married off. Now, everything that I just said about ancient Greece pertained to the way that things were supposed to happen. Does it mean things always happened that way? No. Does it mean that from time to time something like pedophilia may have come into existence? Does it mean that sometimes there were actual cases of non-consensual sex, including rape, between adult men and boys? Yes, that's probably true. In fact, some scholars interpret the story of Zeus and Ganymede as an example of this. In most versions of the story, Ganymede is abducted without the approval of his father, Tros. It also appears that Ganymede never received any gifts from Zeus. He certainly did not return to his community a man and a citizen. Recall that he was put up in the night sky as the constellation Aquarius. But this is not the only mythological account of boy love that we have from ancient Greece. Some fit the model of pederasty much more closely, like the story of the love affair between Poseidon and Pelops. The story begins after Pelops, a boy, is restored to life after his father Tantalus butchers him. After this, he becomes Poseidon's lover. Poseidon takes him to Olympus, teaches him many artisanal and artistic skills, and shows him how to drive a magical chariot. After a time, Pelops returns to Earth, but Poseidon gives him many gifts after this. He even helps him win the heart of a woman named Hippodamia, whom Pelops marries. After this, the two men go on to be lifelong friends, even though their relationship no longer has a sexual component. Alright, so that wraps it up for this comment video. If you have any thoughts about anything that I just said here, feel free to get in touch however you'd like, and I'm really looking forward to continuing our discussion this week as we journey to the lands of medieval Islam and talk about homoeroticism.
Yeah, no.